afternoon. How's that? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's exactly 2:30. Encourage anyone who would like to take a seat to take a seat. And we'll get going and try and make the most of your time during this afternoon. I want to welcome you to our annual Stakeholder Forum. I'm Jonson Cox. I've been chair of the PLA for the last year. I think we had the last year's version of this in my third or fourth week, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here again this year. I hope while you were gathering, you may have seen the film that was showing in the background. And we've played it partly. I mean, it does share some very impressive statistics about the Thames as the UK's largest port and its busiest waterway, and the multiple uses that people, business, society make of the river. If there's one thing we wanted you to see, it's the people. Because we have 400 wonderful, dedicated colleagues who make sure this river runs safely and are working 24 hours round the clock to do so. But of course, their work enables something like 40,000 people to enjoy being on the river, using the river. And that's one aspect. If you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to pick up the summary of our annual report. That tells you on 2 pages what we've been doing for the last year. There will be an annual report of the more conventional format. Well, I give tribute, it's really nicely done with lots of clear points and pictures, which will be laid in front of Parliament in due course and then will be published. But that summary is available outside if you haven't seen it and tells you everything in a nutshell. I think some people are joining us online, so I want to extend a particular welcome, not only to those in the audience, but those who are joining us online, and to make sure to encourage you to take the opportunity to meet our board and our colleagues, which I'm sure you'll do afterwards if you haven't already. We've spent the last year being very looking forward and really thinking about what we want to change. And I would say we've lifted aspiration, we've lifted ambition of the role we want to play in enabling society, London, and other stakeholders outside London to make the most of the River Thames. Many of you contributed during the last year to our vision, and you're going to hear more about it today. I think it's broad, it's ambitious. We want to see a vibrant, a safe, a net zero port. We want to see it be clean. And we had a lot of discussion last year about that, and I think we've moved forward a long way in what we want to do. And we want to see it rich in wildlife. We want to see the estuary resilient to climate change. And we want to see a more diverse Thames, really giving opportunity to everyone. And I do want to acknowledge that isn't just an aspiration, that is happening. And you can see that in the film. Now, 2050, which is the sort of end point of our vision, is a long time away. And I'd encourage you to also look at what we've set ourselves as goals for 2030, which is a period within the expected view of those running the port today. And we're very focused on those medium-term goals we have set. I'd like to give you one example. Many of you are conscious that planning on the river is quite diffuse. Very large number of boroughs, some of them London, some of them outside London, Greater London Authority. And we've not felt that maybe decisions made about what happens where on the river are made in the best interest of the whole river. It's not deliberate, it's just there are too many authorities. So we've embarked on something that is quite common in the sort of property, the amenity redevelopment world, which is to create a master plan for the river. It doesn't have statutory authority, but what it does do is it creates a vision of what and where and when on the river to help those who do make planning decisions make sure that the river and the interests of the river and the users of the river are really factored into all planning decisions. And our development director, Jim Trimmer's led the way on that, and we're seeing really exciting results from the first pilot of that. And this is one example of the convening power that the PLA has, bringing people together who have a common interest in the river. We don't have the power to do everything, but what we do seem to do is to have a power to bring people together. and to use that productively. Now, I'm not going to steal all Robin's thunder because he's coming on in just a moment. I just want to say that that vision, be it the 2030 goals and the 2050 vision, is really the context we're going to use for looking back over the last year and what we've achieved in the last year and how we're looking forward. Then we'll open up for questions. First, you're going to hear from Robin, who I'm sure you all know, our Chief Executive. Then we'll hear from our Chief Harbour Master, Bob Baker, and then our Chief Financial Officer, Julie Tankard. And we took feedback from last year, which was to shorten some aspects of the presentation to make sure we could have proper discussion and questions as we go through. Now, I would also like to just pay tribute that 4 of my non-executive colleagues on the board are with us today, and I really appreciate that, and it's a chance to meet them too. We have Sue Mackenzie sitting here in the front, Paula Carter I can see, Sir Philip Jones, and somewhere, but I can't see her, is our most recent joiner of the board, Vanessa Howlinson. But I know Vanessa is somewhere in the room. There we are, hand raised. And do please, if you have time afterwards to join us, do make sure you talk to any of us about any concerns you have. So I'm going to hand over to Robin to take us through a 2022 review.
Thanks very much, Jonson, and good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to see so many familiar faces here and some new ones as well. So welcome and thank you for coming. As Jonson said, I'm going to do a review of last year and also some forward-looking points, picking up on the Thames vision and some of the commitments we've made, particularly out to 2030, as Jonson said. I'm going to start with a short review of developments over the last year in particular, and starting, if you like, with the port developments. We are very proud to be the biggest port in the UK again for the 4th consecutive year running, with almost 55 million tonnes of cargo handled through the Port of London in 2022. We also saw that our designation as one of the first free ports, the Thames Free Port, which is already generating further business interest and growth activity. So both those things are really positive developments. Now, of course, all of that tonnage, all of that port trade is fundamentally supported and driven by new investment. And one of the reasons we can be very positive about the future is that there are significant investments happening up and down the river at the moment. In the picture there is London Gateway Berth 4, which is a £300 million investment by DP World. Tilbury 2 is now fully operational and further developments planned at that site. And up and down the river, we see significant projects which will help deliver future growth in port trade and, of course, all the jobs which that supports. We're also seeing unprecedented interest in moving light freight on the river. There were some trials last year, including with the Cross River Partnership, and we're hoping this year to see further trials happen. If people, when you talk about the Thames, often sort of talk about the glorious past and the sort of Dickensian era of lots of sort of small vessels moving on the river. Now, it won't quite be like that, but actually we've got the best prospect really in a generation of moving back to a world in which more light freight is moving on the river. And the PLA plays an important part in that. That includes investing in wharves and piers. Here we have Plasto Wharf loading its first vessel after over 20 years, taking heavy goods off our congested roads. So those are some of the developments in the port. If we take, if you like, the river, the sort of further upstream parts of the tidal Thames, great to see passenger numbers rebounding back considerably in 2022 off of the difficulties in the pandemic. On the passenger side, we're back at around 80% of pre-COVID levels, and there's been quite a significant change in the pattern of passenger transport, particularly more off-peak travel, and we're very much hoping to see more international visitors back this summer and next summer. We also saw sport and recreation return to the Tideway, both the big iconic events like the boat race, but also 569 sporting events held across the year involving thousands and thousands of participants, which is a real part of the sort of lifeblood of the Thames. Very much supported by the PLA, both through our Harbour Master team and our team that supports the Active Thames programme. So a very important part of the life of the river. And last but not least, a number of us had the privilege of being involved in the memorable Reflections Flotilla last September, the river's tribute to the late Her Majesty the Queen. And we should always remember this role the river plays in the sort of ceremonial aspect of our national life, something which we should celebrate and do. Now, just coming on to some of the numbers, as Jonson says, there is a handout with some of this on in more detail. I won't go through this in huge amounts of detail. Bob will cover safety in a moment in more depth. I would just highlight that whilst we had one serious navigational safety incident in 2014, which is always, we say, one too many. We always target 0, of course. To put that into context, in 2014, we reported 40. So that's a very significant change. We had 2 reportable internal health and safety incidents. Both, fortunately, didn't involve in large amounts of time off for the 2 people involved. We provided a very strong pilotage service, and Bob will again cover this, but 98.5% service level. For those of you who were here 5 or 6 years ago, that is a transformation, and it is great to see that continuing. We met our goal on licence approvals, 100% target achieved, and that strong port trade delivered us, along with good performance in our commercial teams and in our property business, a healthy surplus for reinvestment, a 12.2 million operating surplus, and we invested 4.7 million in cash. Obviously, we have no shareholder, so all of our surplus is reinvested, and Julie will cover that in more detail in her presentation. So now just looking forward, and a number of people actually gave us feedback on last year's event. They'd like a little bit more on the forward look, so I've done that. Just to put up there the words from the Thames Vision, which we launched last September. And it is an inspiring vision. I think it's worth just reflecting on it for a moment. The words which we crafted with stakeholders over 2 years to sort of pull out the nub of it. The UK's leading port, central to the nation's economy with net zero emissions, a clean river free of pollution and rubbish, supporting more sport, passengers and freight. A resilient estuary adapting to climate change and richer in wildlife. More diverse Thames providing jobs, learning and enjoyment to the whole community. And always everyone staying safe. That is a great thing to get behind. It's interesting interviewing people for jobs at the PLA. So many people will say, why are you interested in working here? Well, the Thames Vision, what's not to be inspired about on working on that vision? But as Jonson said, the words are sort of easy enough. The difficult bit is then the delivery. So I'm just going to touch on a few areas. I won't say much more about the master plan, other than adding to Jonson's introduction that the engagement that Jim Trimmer has led so far on this with the London Borough of Bexley, and next we're turning our attention to Newham and Tower Hamlets, has really demonstrated the appetite of the boroughs and the stakeholders on the river to engage in this. So please do engage in this process, because it will be a much richer master plan with your input. It's one of those projects that once we've started it, we're kind of asking ourselves the question, why haven't we done this before? There's clearly a need for a spatial version of the Thames Vision, which is what the master plan is. So that is something which we're very keen to work with you on. A clean tidal Thames. So we talked about this at the Stakeholder Forum last year. There is obviously a huge public drive across the whole country to clean up our rivers. It is no longer acceptable to have the amount of sewage, pollution, plastic and so on in our waterways. And we are in the process at the moment of developing what we're calling a manifesto for the Clean Thames. We're working with colleagues in the water companies and the regulators on this, and we're planning to publish this in June. This will be the start of a process. We then need to have a much bigger stakeholder engagement exercise over the next year to start delivering the Thames, Clean Thames plan. But it's very important that we signal that we, as the custodians of the tidal Thames, have a right to be concerned about the cleanliness of our river, and that's what we're very much doing through this document. Obviously, we've got a big milestone in 2025 with Tideway Tunnel operational. That will deal with roughly around 90% of the current overflows from the central London sewers, but certainly not the whole problem. And so therefore we need to look at what more is needed beyond Tideway. And we're doing our bit on vessel sewage disposal with a new direction coming into force in 2024, which will mean that the disposal of sewage from vessels will no longer be permitted. A resilient river, a resilient estuary. We'll have more to say on the net zero transition later this year, but I just wanted to focus briefly on the other part of the climate change agenda, the adaptation to climate change, because in the next 2 weeks, the Thames Estuary 2100 plan the refresh of that is due for publication by the Environment Agency. It's a very significant document, this, because this is the country's most important flood infrastructure, protecting 1.4 million people and 320 billion worth of property from tidal flood risk, both the Thames barrier and the other infrastructure. One of the key points from our point of view is to make sure that the plan for the estuary, the flood defences, takes account of the biggest port in the UK being on that waterway. And so we've been working very closely with the agency to make sure that those two things are looked at together. And we're very pleased with the outcome. And do please look out for that publication in 2 weeks' time. Light freight developments I touched on earlier. Trials are continuing with various logistics operators. One of the great benefits of moving goods on the water is, of course, reliability. Apart from the odd day of fog, we can say categorically that it is much more reliable moving freight on the river than it is on the road. 99% reliability on DHL service operating from Putney through to London Bridge and to Wapping. The PLA is going to play an important part in this through the infrastructure provision. It's obviously impossible to run light freight services if you don't have either piers or wharves to get goods on and off. And we've recently purchased Masthouse Terrace Pier on the Isle of Dogs, and we're developing that to be the first dedicated light freight pier in central London. So we see the need for further developments like that in the infrastructure. And the master plan will identify where those need to be. And last but not least, and I'm going to hand over to Bob Baker, our Chief Harbour Master, one of the other commitments in the Thames Vision, which is a more internal one, but very much about the services we provide to the river community, is our £10 million investment in a new marine centre. This is about our core safety services, our VTS services. We're going to centralise them into one location operating out of Gravesend. We're purchasing a new VTS system, which is about future-proofing ourselves with new technology for better ship-to-shore communication and to refurbish the building. It's a very major investment for us. It's a 4-year programme, and it will deliver a state-of-the-art marine centre for the busiest port in the UK. Now, we've looked at other places. We've looked at Rotterdam, which is even bigger than London by quite some margin, but we've looked at some examples elsewhere to make sure that we are at the cutting edge of both operational performance and the systems that support that. So I'm looking forward to seeing that being developed and open by 2026. That brings me to the end of my slide, so I'll just hand over now to Bob to take us through navigational safety and then on to Julie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome as well. I think you stole most of my thunder, Robin, and said most of the things I was going to say, but we'll make a start on navigational safety and performance on the river. Really pleased to say that 2022 was a very positive year as far as volumes are concerned. We bounced back from the slowdown in the COVID period, and we were extremely busy on the river again with our movements and pilotage acts up to pre-pandemic levels, which is a great result after the dip we saw from the pandemic. All areas saw a bit of an increase from actual vessel movements, sea pilotage acts. The only place it dropped slightly down were river pilot acts, but that was made up by more pilot exemption certificate acts throughout the year. So a positive year for volume and transport. Just bear in mind, what we're counting there is just the vessels that have to register with us in our computerized system. So that doesn't count all the movements of recreational craft, the Thames Clippers, for example, and stuff moving around mainly the London central parts. So if you start putting all those numbers in, it's a far higher number than the 22,000 that's mentioned there. The really encouraging, important thing that's come from such an increase or such a high volume of movement is our safety performance. Robin touched on it with the number of serious incidents we've had, and we had one in 2022. And as Robin said, one is one too many. But it's encouraging now that in the last 3 years, we've had 2 serious incidents where, as the graph said, when you go back to 2014, 15, they were quite frequent occurrences on the river. So it's something we're very proud of, how we've raised the safety standards on the river and got vessels moving up and down the river in a much more safe way As with any industry, we want to do everything safely so everyone goes home safe and healthy from their place of work. One of the campaigns we have been doing from a safety perspective is the near miss campaign. It's fairly established practice in health and safety that the more near miss reports you get, the more issues you can tackle before they develop into a real incident. And we've had a really high campaign going throughout the year and throughout last year, and we're still doing it now to increase all river users. That's not just the large deep sea vessels, but every vessel operating on the river, right down to your recreational paddle boarders, canoers and rowers. If you see something, it doesn't have to be an incident, but if you see something that causes concern or it's an observation, please report it to us. It can be done online, it can be done on an app. It gives us that information to allow us to build up trends of where problems are or where potential incidents might develop. And then that allows us to develop plans going forward. And one of the areas that did allow us to develop is something we've done this year, where we had a safe boarding week, where we've had quite a number of reports about access to vessels. So we spent a whole week earlier on in the year boarding. I think we did 265 visits to vessels to check their boarding arrangements to make sure they were safe and compliant. And as it says on the slide there, we saw an 80% increase in the number of near miss reports last year, which is again a great result. For those of you that use pilots and have been at these events in the past, you will recall a long time ago, back in 2016-17, we had significant issues with pilotage. And I'm pleased to say we've now got a much securer, reliable pilotage service on the river. We've been recruiting regularly since 2016, aiming at getting 12 new trainee pilots a year. And we're continuing to do that this year as well. We don't always get the 12 every year. We did 14 last year, and I think we might only end up doing 11 this year, as one of our candidates dropped out at the last moment. But what we do now have is a larger pilotage group, where we've got 93, it says 93 and a half, it's full-time equivalents of pilots compared to the 64 we had back in 2016. So it's quite a substantial increase in investment and training that we've done from a pilot perspective. And it's also had an improvement, and a very important improvement, on the age profile as well. Certainly not wanting to be ageist about it, and we're all capable of working to older ages these days, but when we've got a lot of our pilots in their late 60s, they are likely to retire at some point, and it takes a long time to train pilots up. So having a younger workforce prepares us more for the future. And that's allowed us to do the improvement in the service level Robin touched on, and we are at we did a 98.5% service level last year. And this year already we're tracking it above 99%, which is a far improvement from 2016, when we were down in the low 90s. Final slide from me is on our priorities for the coming year. Not mentioned on the slide, but it goes without saying, maintaining safety and improving our safety standard is always our number one priority. But we will maintain our focus on maintaining the high level of pilotage service and continue with the recruitment and training. As I said, touched on just now, training pilots from scratch up to the most senior pilots is a long process and takes 5 to 6 years to get them from training right up to the top level. Government legislation has brought in new regulations for historic vessels. These are some of the older vessels on the river, and this will bring them up to the modern safety standards as far as survivability in the event of any collision or accident on the river. So those regulations will start coming into force in 2024, and we'll be working with the operators to get that in place. And keeping the theme of safety, we're introducing a compulsory a continual professional development programme, which will be mandated from 2024. And this is really to ensure that the boatmasters' licences that operate the smaller boats on the river and the passenger boats you see operating, is make sure they keep their skills and knowledge and expertise up to the highest level possible, so that, again, that level of safety is maintained. One of the fundamental aims of the Port Marine Safety Code, which are the standards we work to, is to continually improving. So though we've got our safety standards at a much higher level now, our aim is to always go that little bit further all the time. And the final thing that is really occupying us now in this year and going into the next year, as Robin touched on, is our new Marine Centre. This is a really exciting development the PLA are doing to refurbish and redesign our control centre at Gravesend, incorporating the latest technology, not just to deal with the increasing volumes on the river, but also to future-proof us for new technology so that we're ready with the latest technologies as they come in from river movements, whether that be using AI or remote pilotage or remote shipping, all the things that are likely to come in the future. We'll have the right technology in place so that we can develop and expand with it. That's all I wanted to say, ladies and gentlemen, was just to keep that message going that the safety on the river is improving. We want to keep it improving and we'll keep working at it. And with that, I'll hand over to Julie, who will give us the ups and downs on the finances.
So the finances always come last, but all that stuff costs money. So I actually think it's just good to reflect on, sort of a year ago when we first started out in 2022. We were worried about the economy. We'd come out of COVID, reduced volume. In February, Russia invaded Ukraine. We had sanctions. We had an energy crisis. We had high inflation. And then to top it all off, in September, we had a mini budget. And gilt yields went up, pound fell down, and we had sort of big cash calls on our pension, on our LDI funds. So the backdrop of last year was pretty eventful, I would say. And yet, despite that, I think I'm really pleased with our performance because as Robin and Bob have talked about all the things that we plan to do, all that stuff costs money. And therefore, it's important that we actually throw off enough cash every year to be able to support our future investment. And the reason we managed to do that last year is because our volume grew and we had really good cost control. So we managed to keep a lid on our costs. Some of it was, luck, some of it by design. And at the end of the year, we exited the year with 33 million of cash or cash equivalents in the bank to help support these future investments. And if we look at sort of where that growth came from, the blue bars are 2022, and what we can see is, I think he's changed the colours on me. Anyway, what you can see is that, no, that's right, containers have grown every year. Aggregates are a bit hit and miss, but we got a big spike in oil last year. And so we saw this 27% increase in our oil products. And that really helped to drive our overall 6% volume on tonnage, which massively helped our financial performance, as well as our property business, which did very well, which is really where our investment plan over the last few years is starting to bear fruit. But I've stood here before and said we need to make more money out of pilotage. And I'm going to say it again, because the yellow bars are our pilotage profitability. And 38% of our income is derived from pilotage, which is an absolutely critical service that we provide. But when you supply an on-demand pilotage service, it's really expensive. It's a really expensive model. And so what we've tried to do over the last few years is try and drive better profitability. And you only do that by two ways. You increase income or you improve efficiency. And we've been trying to do both. And we're very mindful of the need to remain competitive. But I wouldn't be doing my job if I just didn't signal that we're on a journey here and we haven't finished it yet. And lastly, future challenges. Well, we just talked about the first one. The second one is the pension scheme. We have a defined benefit pension scheme. It is a drag on our business. Outside of those numbers that you saw on the income statement, we spend over 4 million a year on deficit repair payments. There's nothing we can do about that. We have a legal responsibility, but it's a challenge. We absolutely need to diversify our income stream. We saw this through COVID. that we need to be resilient as an organisation, we need to invest, and therefore our investment plan is really important. And it also helps the Thames vision, the things that we've purchased, Plasto Wharf, Primrose Wharf, Masthouse Terrace, the site that we've got at Dartford, all of those things generate an income for us and at the same time deliver on the Thames vision. So they're really important. And last but not least is the transition to net zero. And you will all have the same challenge here, I'm sure. Transitioning to net zero is really expensive when you've got to eventually over time look at potentially replacing all of your, in our case, all of our vessels, or moving, as we have done this last year, to much more expensive fuel, which is better for the environment but costs us a lot of money. Those challenges are there, as well as our income stream. 20% of our income comes from oil-based products. We need to find a way to potentially fill some gaps that might materialise in the future. So I guess just to leave you on one positive, we are in a good sound financial position. We absolutely recognise the need to deliver a fantastic service, and we're willing to invest in order to do that. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Julie. Well, my colleagues will join the stage. While they do so, I'm just reminded that today is London Lifeboat Day. And we have a colleague, I think towards the rear of the room, who would like to remind me that they are fundraising. Most of you know how important the RNLI is to the river. I had the opportunity myself on New Year's Eve to see their service in rescuing someone who'd gone into the river at Battersea Bridge. It's really fundamental. They're building a wonderful new centre, I think just downstream from Blackfriars. It's a really important service to the river. And if you've got your card with you, she has a contactless machine. If I can encourage any donations. It's Libby, and she's somewhere. Perhaps you just raise your hand, Libby, right at the back of the room. So thank you to my three colleagues. I think you get a measure from that of just how significant the last year has been right across the board in achievements, PLA. And of course, my three colleagues, their executive team, deserve a lot of credit, but so do all 400 people in the PLA. And I just want to put on the record thanks again to all of them. Now we're going to questions. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand. We have two people with microphones. Hold on, yes. Give me a moment, I'll come back to you too. I've logged that. The two microphones on either side. If you are joining us on Zoom, type your question in. Alistair's monitoring questions and we'll raise them for you. If you've got a question, just for sound, appreciate if you stand up, tell us who you are, where you're from, and pose your question. So, without more ado, so for gentleman in the first row and then gentleman in the second row.
My name is Simon Anthony. I'm a leaseholder with a balcony overhanging the Thames. Over 2 decades ago, Sir Vince Cable told Parliament that the PLA was behaving irresponsibly towards houseboat owners and had arbitrarily and without consultation imposed a new charging system for river moorings without any redress. A decade later, and as set out in a report on its own website, the PLA's River Works licence charges for end-of-garden moorings were described as being arbitrary, unfair, unreasonable and opaque, and exploiting its monopoly position. Given that charges for river and end-of-garden moorings are now fair and transparent and are clearly set out on the PLA's website, can the panel please explain to me why the equivalent charges for overhanging balconies, piers and terraces are completely arbitrary, unfair, unreasonable and opaque, and why the PLA has failed to learn from the criticisms it received decades ago?
Are you suggesting we charge too much for balconies? I understand that. I don't even know what the charge is for a balcony, but Robin, do you know?
No, I mean, it depends. Look, I understand the situation with balconies, and there is a historic problem that we have got with balconies. We would not today enter into a situation whereby we would charge residents for balconies. Now we would levy that charge on the developer. Because you must understand that when a developer builds a property, what they do essentially is they set the property forward to the river wall and overhang the balcony. And if somebody came to your house and put a balcony over your back garden, then you would want some sort of compensation for that.
I have to say, a lot of those balconies are in the same footprint as local grounds for garden, which in modern warehouses. I'd also say developers did agree licenses with the PLA in the late 90s when most of them were converted, negotiated with a development corporation, which is expanded. They agreed the licenses, and the amounts were usually relatively small. In the last decades, in the last few years, the amounts being charged. And also totally arbitrary. Some people are paying nothing, some people are paying market value for their balcony plus VAT, which no developer would ever agree to. And I just want to sort of let you know that we are getting together all the owners of anything overhanging the Thames, whether it's terraces, piers, balconies, to form some sort of group to try and consolidate how you charge. It appears that when, for instance, the development asks for scaffolding and need permission from the PLA, somebody from the PLA comes along and says, oh, you're not paying enough for your balcony, so we're not paying anything, so we'll now charge you what we like, basically. And I think that's probably going to have to come to an end. And you seem to have, with end of garden moorings and houseboat moorings, houseboats took the table, as I mentioned, end of garden moorings took over Thames Society, with B50s now, to negotiate for a working party to come up with a sensible pricing for that. At the moment, you have nothing on your website about balconies or moorings, etc.
Can I pause us there? I think point's well understood. I suggest we don't go further in answering it today. I think we need to look at it. I understand. I think it's a fair point that we should charge anybody who overhangs into the river space. Because if we didn't, well, where else do, then we would encourage many more people to do it, and then that restricts the river. But I hear your point about it not being transparent and clear. And I think we should take that away, and perhaps we could have further dialogue with you outside.
I'd be happy to meet you and discuss further. I can't promise to agree with you, but I'm very happy to meet and discuss and see if we can find a solution.
Hopefully you won't need to judge to find determination. And that'd be very helpful.
Good, thank you. Gentleman behind you.
Thank you very much. I'm Councillor David Gardner. I'm councillor in the Royal Borough of Greenwich for Greenwich Peninsula Ward, which has 4 kilometres of Thames riverfront all around the peninsula and down to much of Charlton Riverside as well. And the big issue in my ward when I was being elected last year is very much around the environment and air pollution. And one aspect of that is pollution from cruise liners and ships and so forth. And obviously, all of us want to see as much freight and so forth moved by river rather than road as possible. But I just wondered, there's nothing I can see in your vision or in your detailed plans, although there's a photo of a plug somewhere, about ensuring cruise liners and so forth that more in the middle of the Thames do have onshore power and don't keep their diesel engines going. As we know, a cruise liner will generate as much sulfur dioxide as about 3 million cars. It is horrific. Advanced, go-ahead progressive ports have already got online charging, and just wondered what the PLA's plans are in that respect and what the level of ambition is generally in terms of moving to net zero. I'm also slightly concerned, a bit of an emphasis in your vision about road transport, support of the lower Thames crossing, more road connectivity. Just like Wales, the last thing we need in a climate emergency is more roads. We want to encourage modal shift to freight, both to river and to rail, and just wondered whether you could reflect on that in terms of your own plans as well to get that modal shift, because while obviously many vehicles, though not HGVs, will obviously be electric soon, there's still all the particulate matter that's produced by tyres and brakes and so forth, and all the asphalt and the impact of that. And finally, I just wondered, in terms of what your actual plans are for meeting net zero and your climate action plans in terms of canopy cover, trees on the Thames and so forth, because the Thames, as well as a great economic hub, are also very important, as you mentioned, for leisure, for walking and cycling along the banks and so forth, and wondered what your plans are in terms of tree cover. Thank you.
Councillor, thank you for your 3 questions. So if we take the cruise ship one first, just to say I understand, and you might not agree with this, but I understand the studies that have done suggest those cruise ships don't contribute materially to air pollution. I understand you might contest that, and I hear that, and I'm very happy to go back and review those. But let me have Robin answer that question, and we'll come to your second one.
Yes, thanks, Jonson. So I think just to take this, so we did, this came out a lot in the public meetings over the last 3 or 4 years, the impacts of the cruise ships at Greenwich, and we went through a process to install air quality monitors around the ship tier, and using the sort of standard methodology that the EU specifies. So it's a very robust sort of monitoring system, and in fact, all of the data is publicly available, and we'll talk to you afterwards and perhaps give you some summary of it, but essentially it does show, we monitored over the course of 2019 when the cruise ships were in, obviously they weren't in the pandemic, and the cruise ships had no discernible impact on local air quality at any of those monitoring stations. Including, exactly. Now that isn't to say, of course, that the cruise ships don't emit, but the fundamental reason is that they emit a long way above the monitoring points that are 2 meters above ground level. So now we did at a public meeting then have a discussion about people living on the 5th, 6th floors, and we've offered to do air quality monitoring at that level if anybody's happy to have air quality monitoring equipment on their balcony or whatever, and we haven't yet had any takers for that. So it is an issue we absolutely take seriously, and we invested considerable time to sort of do that data collection. But I think it doesn't take away the general point I think you make, which is that air quality absolutely is another part of the net zero transition we need to make. And I think maybe it's not as clear as it should be, but when we talk about the net zero transition, we very much mean local air pollution as well as carbon, and that's part of our sort of goal for the vision.
Can I suggest, Robin, we make available these studies? We have no interest to protect here. If we've missed something in those, or the consultants have missed it, or you'd like to have it done at the 6-story level rather than 2 meters above ground level, we're very happy to be part of that.
Can I say on shore power then? Because I think that's a very interesting point. And we are absolutely on the same page on this. I mean, that's obviously fundamentally the net zero transition in the port will be delivered by electricity and hydrogen. Obviously, hydrogen in various forms is under discussion, but not yet available. In the short term, shore power can provide a solution, but it's very expensive. And countries which have invested significantly in shore power have mostly been hugely publicly subsidised by government. And there hasn't been as much funding for that in the UK. However, there is a fund at the moment that the DFT is running called ZEVI, which stands for Zero Emission Vessel and Infrastructure. I'm looking at Derek there, I always forget the I. The ZEVI fund, and one of the bids into that fund is in fact for some sort of shore power flow facility around Greenwich Ship Tier. So now, of course, we may not get funding for that, but we're a partner in that, so we're very keen to find a solution to that for the reasons you say.
And we are talking to UK Power Networks, who are the distribution company, aren't we? Can I go to the roads point? I'll come to you over there next. And hold a second, everyone. Let me just finish this question. The roads question. The road and the Lower Thames crossing is not for us to determine whether it happens or not. I understand fully your point about road transport. We obviously have a role in licensing someone going underneath the Thames. We own the riverbed. I don't think we can get into the question of traffic because that isn't for us to determine. That really sits with government, with Highways England, etc. But I'm sure you'll understand us not dealing with that. Your third question, I'm not absolutely certain I understood, but I think it was about trees and access along the river. Something we wholly support. We may hear other questions about this too, but about the ability of people to use the riverbank. Unless Robin's got a specific say, all I would say is we are very, very open to people in London, and I don't just mean, I mean the length of the estuary, being able to use the riverbank, and planting of the riverbank and anything that improves the environment is great with us. And if there's things we could be doing to encourage that, please let us know. Okay. Now, look, I've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to the gentleman with the white shirt, and then I'll come to the gentleman closer, and then I'll come to the back of the, further back in the room. I see Lady Barclay and one over here. Right, let's keep questions fairly short if we could.
All right. So you said
Could you stand up and introduce
no
yourself?
worries. You said that net zero is about local air pollution, so essentially for local residents. But someone has been investigating the context in which the net zero projects are being decided and funded. And I think he's a journalist, but I'm not sure. And he started to uncovering what he says seems to be a large network of conflicts of interest between those who work in councils and
Sorry, those who are?
who work in councils
Yes.
and public trusts, such as the PLA, for example, and shareholders of directors of the net zero companies that benefit from such projects. And this apparently is sometimes hidden via family members, such as children or spouses with a different name, etc. So the question to you today is, are these conflicts of interest the reason why the PLA has been funding and pushing for net zero projects, even when the local residents directly impacted by those projects are unanimously against it?
Sorry, just repeat that last bit. What I don't quite get your concern.
The last question. Are these conflict of interest the reason why the PLA has been funding and pushing for net zero projects, even when the local residents directly impacted by those projects are unanimously against it?
Well, I think first of all, and your point about shareholders, conflicts of interest, I do need to say the PLA does not have a shareholder. We're not there to serve any particular shareholder interest.
Yeah. I think he was referring to
anyone who has
family members, etc.
And anyone who has conflicts of interest, which probably extends to family members, certainly at our board level will declare those, either recuse themselves or declare them. That's perfectly normal. To your point about...
so there are some at the PLA. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not aware.
Is that what you're saying by it's normal?
Sorry, I'm really not sure I get the point. Any board, I can only talk about at the board level, but the same would apply at the management level. Anyone who has a conflict of interest, and please feel free to approach me afterwards if you think anyone does, will have declared it. I'm not actually aware of anyone having declared a conflict of interest in relation to one of our projects. If I've missed one, let me know and I'll tell you whether they declared it or not. It's not top of mind. I believe our board operates very impartially. And that's one of the great things about not having a shareholder, actually. We may come back to that. To your point about we may promote and fund things in the interest of the river as a whole, when some of those may have an impact on local residents who don't like them.
Because it links to the fact that before you said the net zero thing is about local air pollution, so it's for local residents.
I think we're probably being slightly loose in talking about net zero as air pollution, but the net zero is for us about the whole environment of the Thames. That's the aqueous quality, the emissions on the Thames, and any other form of air pollution, including, as the councillor from Greenwich mentioned, particulate emission. We are concerned about all of that. But of course, this is the nature of making change in society, isn't it? That any change you may make for the good of the whole will have an impact on someone.
Who is the whole in your sentence? The people who live on the river or the people in UK?
Well, our job is to serve all users and interested parties in the river, not the whole UK, but to serve all parties on the river. So
the local residents are in the center of this examination of the interest?
Well, it will still be the case that there are things that might affect, and maybe Robin has an example. Do you have an example, Robin?
Yeah, I was wondering, I can sort of just say to you very categorically that there are no conflicts of interest on any of the projects which we've sort of personal conflict of interest of that sort on any of the projects we've funded, I can categorically say that to you. I wonder if you're referring to net zero marine services.
I think it's part of it.
Is that part of your what?
I asked the guy, but I think it's part of it. Yes.
So the PLA has invested in 2 electric charging points for other members of the audience's information through a company called Net Zero Marine Services, which is, as Jonson said, this is an investment which we're making for the benefit of the river. It's part of that transition to enable vessels on the river to...
So when you say the benefit of the river, you mean the benefit of...
Sorry, if I could just finish my
the
point,
river
if you don't mind.
Sorry, could you let Robin answer this? And then I think when he's answered that, I'd like to suggest, so I can get to other questions, we take the discussion at the end.
The benefit must be to people, not to objects. So the benefit of who, not just the river.
So the benefit, we've invested into electric charging points because we believe that the infrastructure to enable the transition to electric vessels is going to need public funding or some kind of funding which is not going to come from the market. And the PLA stepped into that space to start that. So there is some infrastructure for electric charging points. And we believe that's for the benefit of the river, by which we mean the users of the river who are in vessels which are therefore not using fossil fuels, and that obviously has a wider societal benefit. So that's the reason why we've made that investment. We could talk about it further, but that is, the only reason why we've made that.
Okay, I take your offer on talking about it further. Thank you.
Can we hold that one there? If you want to give us a specific example, which will make it much easier, please, afterwards, can we do that? Can I turn to the gentleman here? Yes, with your hand up, and then I'll move towards the rear of the room.
Thank you. My name is David Mosim.
Could you speak up a little, please?
My name is David Mosim-Abali. I'm operations manager for the Queen Victoria Siemens Seafarer Centres. So we operate seafarer centres in a number of ports across the Thames and the UK. I guess my question is mainly around diversity and attracting underrepresented, people of color, women in the PLA and in the Thames. I think since the 2 years I've been in this sector, I've noticed that because I follow the PLA on LinkedIn and other social networks, every time there's 2 new pilotage trainees, I just, when will there be somebody from color just being there?
Right.
So I guess my question is there a strategy, is there anything the PLA wants to do around attracting talents from every middle, senior, entry level, more diverse PLA?
Absolutely. I can give you assurance this is really high on our agenda. In my role of building and running the board, I can tell you as board appointments come up, I've got a very, very clear personal, and the board has a commitment that we increase the diversity. We do really well on gender diversity. I accept we so far have done very poorly on ethnic diversity. And I think just watch this space, please. In terms of, let's go to people coming on to work at the river. When we launched our vision last year, we had 10 young people who came together, apprentices and people early in their career from across the river came, and they did a dance, and they came and performed at the launch event. And I was really, really pleased to see the level of diversity and of people, not diverse in every sense, ethnic, gender. And also what was really pleasing was to talk to a number of people whose families had no connection with the river, had in their upbringing had no connection with the river. So we are diversing what's a truly committed and very, very professional force of people who've been on the river through their career, their families' careers, etc., but bringing new people in, much more diverse. I accept you may not see that fully yet, but I want to reassure you it's really important to us. And we have to remember, we serve London and of course upstream and downstream, the other areas on the Thames, and we need to reflect the characteristics of London, which is one of the most diverse cities in the world.
Jonson, could I just Just to add to that, and it's a great question. Thank you for it. We also see this on the river as a whole, and it's actually very encouraging to see, looking at the stats on diversity on some of the river operators, that things are really changing. So we support the Thames Skills Academy, for example, and through that bringing apprentices into the industry. And if you take, I know that, for example, City Cruises took on 10 apprentices, not one of whom was a white male in the last year, and that's absolutely not, but if you go back 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. You only need to go onto a Thames clipper to see the diversity in their workforce. So I think things are changing, but it's, as Jonson said, we know absolutely this requires attention, and we're giving it.
Thank you. Right, so I'm going to ask a few questions. Lady Barclay there, and then the gentleman across the other side of the aisle. Then I'll come back over there later, but okay, we've got loads of questions, so let's be brief on questions if we could.
My name is Dido Barclay.
Sorry, we can't hear you quite.
Hello?
Yes, much better.
My name is Dido Barclay, and I come from an organisation called Thames Bank, which is about sustainable management of the whole river. I'd like to just start off with, I can't fault what you do as a Port of London from the point of view of business, but the river itself belongs to the whole nation. And my concern is that the stakeholders are not being adequately involved in, I've heard a lot of people speaking today, and I'm very concerned about the water issues, and you know all about that, Jonson, having been head of Ofwat. And also the nature side of it, I haven't heard very much mentioned about. And as we now have 3-4 strategies starting all the way down the Thames, it seems there's been a big gap in this presentation to stakeholders about the nature on the river. And you've got this manifesto for clean water, and as we said in the harbour revision order, you failed to involve stakeholders. And this water business is really, really important. The government itself now is completely failing all our rivers and tributaries. Therefore, if you just work with the government, you are going to get a rotten system. And it's absolutely important that you get independent people from the whole of the Thames area, stakeholders, to work with you to ensure we have a proper water system, which is nature-based on the river and not with old-fashioned ones like the tunnel. So that's, also with the water, which is fundamental, is Thames Landscape Strategy and the other groups down the river are actually doing rewilding, and that is nature-based solution to stop the water going into the sewers. But you haven't mentioned that at all, and it's absolutely fundamental. Okay, so what I'd like to say, you are not prioritising the river, and we need a stakeholder forum. I'd like to start that today at this meeting, so that we have representatives up and down the Thames who can come to you, sit round at the table and discuss a lot of these matters, including the moorings and everything else, because at the moment it's top down and it needs to be bottom up if it's going to be legal.
I think you know from both your discussions with Robin earlier in the week and with me, that we could not disagree more fundamentally with you. Let me explain why we disagree so fundamentally. We have hundreds of stakeholders. They don't all want to be consulted in one stakeholder forum. And we go out of our way to consult. This meeting is a very important part of it, but not all our stakeholders want to be here. Some want to meet us in more closed sessions. Some want to meet us elsewhere on the river. Some want us to go out on the river with them. And all I can say is I think there's a very strong record of doing that. And there is not a one-size-fits-all for sort of stakeholder relations.
But we don't know what any of the other stakeholders want, and that is what's missing.
Well, let me finish. Our vision for 2050 had the widest possible consultation. That was the opportunity to hear from every stakeholder. And I came into this halfway through that. And I'm really pleased with the number of times I hear from people, thank you for inviting us to contribute to the vision. Thanks for taking on board. Of course it's complex because you're trading off all sorts of interests. And the problem of being a sort of decision maker is always how do you balance interests. Let me turn to your point about the water in the Thames. I think no one cares more passionately about that than me. I'm horrified by what we discovered.
You went along with the tunnel, which was the wrong solution.
Well, you have had a long-standing view that the Thames Tideway Tunnel is the wrong solution. And were it possible in London to create the open spaces to have sustainable drainage, that would be a better solution, I agree, to control runoff of rainwater. Were it possible to retrofit all homes in London to get away from the combined sewer where rainwater goes into sewer, that would be great. I invite you to consider the complete and utter disruption to the city if every householder had to
We had worked on that.
reconnect to the
that when we
drains.
argued.
And in my previous roles, I've looked very, very carefully at that and given the Thames Tideway a real, but in concept, a real sort of kicking to understand whether that could work. The third point I make is the Tideway Tunnel is part of the solution. It's not the whole solution. It's a fantastic feat of engineering. It's a 7.2 metre diameter tunnel. Frankly, with what we know about climate change now compared to when it was developed, it probably should be a 9 or 10 metre diameter tunnel. What it is doing is conveying overflows directly to a treatment works, so they get treated at Beckton. So we're going to differ from you on that, but we also really strongly believe that there's a lot more to do to clean up the river, to stop discharges upstream of Hammersmith, to think about any overflows that come as climate change gets more pronounced. Robin referred to the manifesto. I don't know whether we're operating entirely within our powers or not, but we are utterly determined to use the convening power that we have as the port and as the owner of the riverbed to get the Thames cleaned up, to go further than the tunnel. The manifesto we will publish will be quite demanding. And in that, by the way, just for anyone who's concerned, will be the issue of how we clean up the wet wipes that have polluted the foreshore of the Thames, particularly in the sort of Putney, Hammersmith area. We're really passionate about that. Maybe you don't see that now, but I can assure you it's in the works. And we've just hired a director of sustainability. Sorry?
I just said the public, the stakeholders need to be involved in
Well,
these decisions.
I'm really sorry. I'm really going to differ with you because we really do go out of our way to consult and to listen. And if you think that listening is about having one public event, it's important to do the public event, but it's also important all the other discussions we had. Sadly, I had COVID, so I couldn't be there, but we jointly sponsored with Thames 21 the count of wet wipes and some cleanup of wet wipes. We are out there talking to these stakeholders every day. But I think we have to just agree to disagree on that.
We need a discussion round table. That's what I'm pointing. We need a round table. I'll stop there because you haven't got much time. But we need a round table discussion with representatives of whoever wants to be on the stakeholders forum. Thank you.
The gentleman on the other side of the aisle there. I will come to these sides of the room shortly. Oh yeah, we must give people online a chance. I will go to Alistair next, but I won't forget the rest. Sir.
John Spencer from GPS Marine. We operate tugs and barges on the Thames. We move about 1 million tonnes a year, and we operate a marine civil engineering business as well. In the main, we move parcels of about 15 to 1700 tonnes. Each one of those is about 200 lorry movements off the roads. I hear about the Thames vision. I hear lots of words about developing water freight and how it's all lovely. The big problem that we have is it is virtually impossible to get planning consent for wharves. I hear the guy here from Royal Borough of Greenwich. I started working on the reactivation of Tunnel Wharf in 2017. We still don't have planning consent. EA have been objected all the way through. They only removed their objection in December 2022. The council managed to get it wrong 4 or 5 times, trying to get it into committee. And this is not unusual. When I speak to guys at the PLA about how long is it going to take to get planning consent, I'm told, well, think about 5 to 7 years. So this is going according to plan. What I want to know is, in order to deliver the vision, because I don't think moving a couple of parcels up a pier is the answer. To deliver the vision, you've got to move 100 vanfuls of goods to a location and then distribute them. What can the PLA do to improve the time that it takes to actually get planning permission for wharves? Because if it takes 7 years per wharf, you know, we're going to be years and years and years until there's a difference. So what can the PLA do?
Point well made. And I'll just say one thing, then pass to Robin. I mean, You know from what we say in our vision, we want to expand the use of the Thames for all these purposes, and bringing wharves back into action is really important to us. I share your concern on planning, really do. I think our master plan process is an important step in the PLA influencing others about where wharves should be situated and why it's so important. But Robin, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, John, we agree with you. I mean, the process shouldn't take 7 years. Two practical things we can do to help with that. One is the master planning work, because if we can get agreement from all the boroughs, particularly in the east part of the river, that site A is the right location for a wharf to be developed, then when it comes to the local plan process and then individual planning decisions, then there will be more consensus around that site in the first place. So that's the first point I'd make. The second, even more practically and tactically, if you like, is the Environment Agency. We are working with the Environment Agency to have a dedicated officer who works alongside the PLA team to understand the river better and to make it quicker to deal with that part of it. So I think on both points, we are on the same page. I guess the only sort of counter though, and it's come out in this meeting, is that obviously there needs to still be proper opportunity for local communities and others to feed in to the process, because every individual application has both pro and anti. So we need to make sure that the democratic process works, but it shouldn't take 7 years. It should be a lot quicker than that, and we're on the same page as that.
I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Robin, we're funding that work to increase the AA's attention to this, which I'm very pleased with doing. Right, let me take stock a moment on questions. Alistair, I think we should hear from one of the online ones, or two.
Okay, if I can give you a few. The first one's from Peter Cox, and the essence of his question is, what can the PLA do to encourage the availability of visitor moorings? And he cites a number of options for moorings, including Galleons Marina, that are no longer available. That's question one.
Should we just deal with that? I think it might be for Bob, that one probably.
I mean, the issue of visitors' moorings has been raised before at these meetings, and we have looked at the moorings available on the river, and there are quite a lot of moorings at different locations which are greatly underused. I think the problem we always have here is moorings in places which we don't have control over, St. Catherine's and places like that. So unfortunately, getting the moorings where visitors want to go to is not always within our jurisdiction, because it's not our property or our ability to develop it. But there are lots of visitor moorings on the river, and they are greatly underutilised. We did a survey about 4 years ago, and they weren't heavily utilised. I think it's more a question of location of them rather than the availability of them.
Next one. David Green, he's asking a question around carbon offsetting as part of a net zero strategy, both for the PLA and also for operators on the river, citing some of the newer vessels that may be coming onto the Thames in the next while.
Do we have a view on offsetting, Robin?
Yeah, I guess it would depend exactly what's meant by offsetting. I mean, our own net zero plan for the PLA does not include offsetting, in the sense that we're committed to get to net zero, meaning actually getting rid of the carbon rather than purchasing offsets. However, I personally believe that things like biodiversity net gain and projects which deliver biodiversity gain and carbon sequestration can play a part, and so we're certainly looking into that, and whether the Thames foreshore can be used as sites that promote biodiversity and sequester carbon. So it depends on the detail of that, but that's a broad position.
And I think there was a statistic missing, wasn't there, in the presentation, halving the carbon footprint?
We have indeed.
In 2022? Mm-hmm. It's good, that, isn't it? Right. One more, Alistair, then I need to come back to the room.
One quick one. Diana Roth posed a question about tree works at the Leg of Mutton, which we've already passed to Jim Trimmer, who's looking into it.
Good.
And the only other one is around infrastructure for sewage discharge when this is banned from being pumped into the river in 2024.
Yes, we're very conscious that, of course, when it's banned, there do need to be off-take points for pumping out sewage. If need be, the PLA may need to invest in a sewage barge. But Robin, what's
I'm glad I'm not answering tree works at the Leg of Mutton. I don't know about that. So in fact, we consulted on the question of whether the river operators wanted PLA to provide or fund additional sewage disposal facilities when the new regulation comes into force. And the response to the consultation was no, that river operators are happy to make their own arrangements. I would just emphasise that the regulations will come into force and we will wish to enforce them. So we're looking forward to ensuring that the provision that is provided by individual operators is adequate to comply with the regulation.
But note our willingness to take action, including provision of barges if it's not forthcoming from the market. Right, gentleman over there with the hand up, and then the lady next to him, then come over to you, sir.
Hi, I'm Ralph Hardwick. I've lived in the Isle of Dogs for 35 years. Just one point that came up with regard to the harbour revision order and with this 2024, is that contained in your request for the new harbour revision order about dealing with sewage outflow?
No, because it's within our existing powers.
Okay, and the second part is of this is in the harbour revision order, I commented on the fact that you'd scoped out vessel emissions and scoped out vessel noise. In terms of actually trying to sort of make improvements on the river environmentally, why aren't these not included in your harbour revision order? And the main point I wanted to make, can we have an update about West India Pier? Because it's gone a bit quiet there since we had a meeting. And coming on to the fact of about funding, the company you're engaging with to do works isn't doing anything. It's obviously broken the Riverworks licence, hasn't applied to the local authority, and is not actually doing things in what you'd expect them to do in terms of proceeding forward on those elements.
2 points, noise and West India Quay.
Yeah.
Robin.
So, as Robin said, the sewage one is not in the harbour revision order, but the harbour revision order, we're not required or allowed to add new things into the harbour revision order in terms of extending our powers. So it wouldn't be appropriate to put those things in the harbour revision order. And in fact, the Marine Management Organisation would most likely knock that back anyway. So that isn't the mechanism to address those issues. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be addressed. I'm just saying that's not the right mechanism.
Because the Marine Management Organisation is just a facilitator.
But the harbour revision order isn't the mechanism in order to do that. The harbour revision order is very much about modernising an act which is 60 years old to be able to deal with our current operation, but it's not to add new things in there.
Julie, so what is the vehicle for addressing, or the organisation for addressing noise from the Thames? Is it the environmental health of each council? Or?
No idea.
I think we're going to get into the issue of Henry VIII powers. So basically, you can't use a harbour revision order to amend the primary legislation in a way which is sort of outside what Parliament originally intended. Is I think the thing. But no, I think the answer is that in relation to noise. Certainly, it's the jurisdiction falls if vessels are underway to Port Health. I think we've talked about this at a public meeting, Ralph, haven't we? And in fact, there have been some good examples where City of London, Port Health have taken enforcement action, but they need real-time information of noise in order to be able to obviously go after people, literally, using their vessel. Whereas if it's alongside, then obviously it's the local authority under the normal noise local provisions. So that's not for the PLA. I think on the air quality side, I think I need to understand what powers you're referring to as to know what we would need to...
Basically, the vessel emissions is all sort of pushed to the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency to enforce, whereas you're responsible for the river. Why isn't there some local element to address that?
Should we pick that one up outside if we might? But could we deal with the sort of swiftly with the complex position at West India Quay?
Yes, I mean there was an enforcement issue there, and I know we've had some quite extensive correspondence, and we have followed up in relation to the breach of the licensing condition. But I'm just looking at James Trim actually. That's not an ongoing situation, is it? There we go.
I know it's a complex position, right? If I may, to the lady next to you.
Well, funnily enough, it was a similar question. So I'm Councillor Rachel Bentley in the Borough of Southwark. So I very much agree with your vision and with the lady over there that the Thames, it's our national river. So I think, you know, it's important that we recognise we all have a stake in it. But it really was that point that you made earlier. You can convene people, but we really need to get serious about this enforcement issue because we have these breaches going on, whether it's sewage, whether it's noise, whether it's planning, environmental issues. And you, as the Port of London Authority, we are looking to you to bring people together. Even if you don't have the powers enforcement, you've got to, I think, from this room, we're saying we're looking to you to do that because it can't be that you phone Southwark or you phone Tower Hamlets or you phone the Environmental Agency. Somebody needs to get serious about this. And as a public agency or public representative, we're asking you to do that.
A role we take on, are doing. Sounds like you don't see that we're doing it, so we take that feedback.
Could do better. Yeah.
But I mean, let me just answer the one that's occupied quite a lot of our time in recent months, which has been, you talk about sewage discharges. So we kicked off quite a lot of investigation work. I learned something, and I thought I knew about the water industry. I learned that these rather repeated discharges of sewage in the Thames are not, much to my surprise, Thames Water was actually in compliance with its permits. That surprised me, I have to say. What it turned out was those permits have not been updated for decades. And so the problem is with the permitting regime. So you say, what do we do? Robin and I got on to the relevant chair and relevant director in the Environment Agency, challenged them on it. We know that permits are being updated at the moment as part of the tideway coming in. We're applying our pressure there. You'll see that in our manifesto. Of course, some of that doesn't make its way into sort of public domain until we've achieved something. So that's just an example where we are on it. If you have other ideas about how we should be engaging with stakeholders, please do talk to us. I have to say I've made a number of attempts to contact some of the public authorities along the river since I came into post, and they're not always interested. So sometimes it's not for want of trying, okay? But look, point taken. Gentleman over here has been patient.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Prynne. I'm one of 60 residential boat owners who have boats at Chelsea Reach, which is a set of moorings operated by a mooring operator who has a Riverworks license with the PLA. And I'm not going to go into details. This is not the time or place, but indeed I have informally spoken to Julie Tankard about it. But I just wanted to say that over the last really 5 years, we've have very, very grave concerns about the conduct of the operator. And I appreciate that houseboats of the mooring operator, yes.
Right, not the PLA.
Not the PLA.
Right.
But the mooring operator has a contractual relationship with the PLA,
yep.
And we have a contractual relationship with the mooring operator. So we don't directly have a
yep.
relationship with the PLA. But what I wanted to say was this, really, and ask. The Port of London, obviously, in financial terms, would probably regard the contribution of houseboats and their license fees as fairly insignificant. But I'd like to emphasize that in human welfare terms, the impact of what happens on the river is quite considerable so far as residential boat owners are concerned. And so what I was really seeking is an assurance from the PLA that if those concerns are clearly set out and indeed communicated to you and your officers, that they will be given very serious consideration.
I have some knowledge of that because we have discussed that at our board, particularly the issues around Chelsea. Bob, is there anything you or Julie would like to add to that?
Yes, so Andrew and I did speak about this earlier, and I think we absolutely can give you that assurance. So if as we discussed, you put all of those concerns in writing, it will require a number of, harbour masters, planning, licensing to get involved, and we'll have a look at it for you and see what the situation is.
I'm very grateful.
Very conscious of the importance of houseboat occupancy on the Thames.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, gentleman over there with his hand up.
Thank you. Dwight Demore from Tarmac.
Sorry, from?
Tarmac.
Oh, yes.
Chairman, I hear what you say, and I fully appreciate PLA has no policy responsibility for decisions around the Lower Thames crossing. But my question, and having sat through a really interesting briefing at PLA's infrastructure group, my question to Robin and Julie is, to what extent was the original timetable built into your business plan, and what impact is the delay going to have on that business plan, and what representations are you making to government about it?
Robin, why don't you take that one?
Slightly flippant answer. I think we wouldn't bake government infrastructure deadlines into our business plans. I think it's the sort of the no. The truth is, it's not material in the sense of our sort of port trade projections in the short term. Obviously, if you take the long term, our view is that the Lower Thames crossing would be beneficial for trade through the Port of London, through greater connectivity. And I do take the point earlier around the wider debate about the impact of road building in the context of net zero transition, but that's obviously an issue for the government and the country as a whole to think about. For our impact on the port, it would be economically beneficial, but we haven't factored it into sort of short-term financial plans. So the delay in the project is not going to affect our sort of near-term financial planning, is the answer.
I suspect we have relatively little influence on the infrastructure timetable of the government on this. I have a brief question here, and then look, I did promise we'd sort of close by about now, so we could informally discuss, and anyone who didn't want to raise a question in the full session could talk to us. So just take a couple more questions and then.
Hi, I'm Simon Howard. I'm one of the houseboat owners. It's not about houseboat owners, it's about ULEZ. My assembly member tells me that the PLA is steadfast in its opposition to applying ULEZ through the centre of London.
I could not, sorry, I think we have to fundamentally disagree with that.
Okay, well, it was my assembly member, okay? But as he points out, he says, because he's been asking questions recently about emissions on the river, which he's getting no answers on.
I think we are surprised we're not, Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, we're surprised there's not traction on a ULEZ for the river. Okay,
well, this is the assembly member. He's dealing with TfL and he's dealing with the mayor. I've got the string of emails, but he is surprised that ULEZ doesn't apply. ULEZ obviously applies to all of the truck, bus and coach operators, but it doesn't apply to any of the commercial traffic on the river.
Well, I'm sure there's a valid point about the timescale for commercial traffic and commercial boats to adapt. But I do know that many of the operators on the Thames are seriously thinking about how to adapt. Robin and I went to hear about plans for electric vessels only recently. But we are not the opponent of ULEZ, I think it's fair to say, Robin.
No, we're certainly very keen to work with GLA on this. I think it's complicated because obviously, and unlike the roads where there are quite simple standards for HGVs and the Euro standards for HGVs and for cars, on the river there's a plethora of standards for vessel engines, and there's a lot of historic vessels. So actually the application of a ULEZ type scheme to the river is not at all straightforward. But we have had some discussions with GLA officials about that. And as yet, you're right, it hasn't made any progress, but we are absolutely willing to talk to them about it.
Is there any last question anyone wanted? I must come back to Alistair. I shall come back last, but let's take this question, then I go to Alistair.
Afternoon, I'm Jeff Simons from Thames Clippers. We operate the fast ferries on the Thames. My question relates to noise also. With the growing amount of residential developments on the river, some oversailing as well, which is a good thing for increased passenger usage on the river. But there seems to be a general perception in some areas that general river use for approved commercial use is perceived as a nuisance. So I'm interested in the PLA's position on the use of horns by our masters for safe navigation.
Interesting question. Right, our Chief Harbour Master does get to answer this one, I think.
As you'll know, Jeff, there are rules and regulations where horns need to be sounded for safety reasons. and we would always encourage and want masters to use their horns if there was a need to do it from a safety perspective. There are rules and regulations that horns can be said or should be sounded at certain other times, like when you're pulling off a jetty and things like that. Would we want that all the time? No, we wouldn't. We'd want it more for the warning side of things, giving it warning to other traffic if there's a potential incident or a potential conflict developing, and we would want to keep it to a minimum that could be possibly done while maintaining safety, which is always going to be our starting point.
I hope that addresses your question. Thank you. Alistair, last two to you.
So the last two quick ones. First one's from Kevin. What's the PLA stance on the preservation of the natural beauty of the Thames path against its industrialisation?
Yes, I mean, the Thames path, of course, is long and varied, and I think the answer probably differs in different parts of the river. So if we take the part that the PLA owns, which is from sort of Putney Reach up through Kew towards Mortlake, there we've had lively discussions at our Putney public meeting around this, and we have a very carefully designed plan for the vegetation works, which strikes a balance between the needs of navigators on the river to avoid too much overhanging vegetation that impacts on rowers, for example, and the need to protect key species like the native black poplar and others. So in that location, it's a sort of balance. Obviously, in other locations, the Thames path runs through some very industrial sites in the estuary, and there have to be some diversions for that reason. So I think it sort of depends on where we're talking about. But our general stance is like many things we've talked about today. There's often a tricky balance to be struck between the sort of competing objectives around whether it's biodiversity and industrial use or noise versus economic activity. All of these things are things that we try and balance in our role.
Okay, and the last one is Chris Ingram. And this is for you, Julie, I think. I suspect this isn't for Bob. Is your pension fund not approaching being fully funded now that interest rates have risen to more normal levels such that you do not need to keep contributing to it?
Oh, I wish. No, unfortunately, is the simple answer.
And I would add to that, last year only demonstrated how volatile the funding of pension funds can be.
Yeah, absolutely. What I will say is that our pension fund is closed to new entrants. So we now have a new defined contribution scheme, which won't create a future liability to the PLA. So this is a historic problem. And whilst we have 400 employees, we've got about 2,500 pensioners, and we do have an obligation to them.
And as many of you will know, this is a common issue for many businesses, many authorities throughout the country. And I remind you what last year showed us in terms of volatility of funding. I think with that, with your agreement, we should close the formal bit of the meeting. There are refreshments next door. We'll be around to take any more questions anyone would like. But I'm conscious we're seeing slight drift off of people, so I think it's important to call a halt at this moment. I've got a couple of last things I want to say. So there's a lot of PLA people here, which is great. So you'll find one of us if you have a further question. There's a couple of thanks I need to give. First of all of you know Alistair, and you know that Alistair masterminds this, and very large part of the, I have to say, very wide consultation that I see the PLA doing with stakeholders. He's been our Director of Corporate Affairs for 17 years. He led the vision that we created and the ambition that is in the vision. And he's moving on, very sadly. He's moving on to be CEO of the UK Flour Millers Association, and so he'll be responsible for your food. And I just want to thank Alistair for all that he's put into the PLA over those 17 years. It's going to be a big act to follow for his successor. But secondly, I'm beginning to wonder if this is personal to me, having joined the PLA, because I thought I was joining a relatively stable organisation, but I'm sure it's not. We lose over the rest of this year, so not imminently, but over the rest of this year, we lose two of our executive directors, both to retirement, although neither looks to me ready for retirement, I have to say. Julie, who been our finance director for quite a few years, and Julie's really brought, I think, a relationship with our commercial users that has, I think, been handled very well and has really developed that relationship. And she's also brought the drive to use our surplus productively, first and foremost to reinvest in the PLA, in technology, equipment, and secondly to invest in projects that open up further developments on the river, to do what Robin said, which is to use our surplus productively to enhance the river. So many thanks to Julie, and she's not off quite yet, but since by the next time we get together next year, there'll be new faces. And later this year, Bob says he's going to retire. I keep questioning this one. Of course, you saw a couple of really big achievements under Bob's tenure. You saw what he's done to incidents on the river, to safety on the river. Huge improvement from 2014. And for our very important commercial users in the river, where pilotage is incredibly important, it's a very small part, but it's a critical part to a vessel. And it's probably a lot more complex than most of us realize. Certainly, I assumed, you knew that a vessel was in the Bay of Biscay and you knew when it would steam into the Thames estuary. It's not like that at all. It's totally variable. These vessels probably go to Antwerp, to Rotterdam. They may get delayed there. You don't know when they're going to arrive. They arrive on short notice on a sailing from Rotterdam, and they need a pilot then and there, because you can't be paying the demurrage of a vessel sitting at sea. Bob has got on top of that pilotage service, and you saw the results there, the 98.5% service levels met. So with enormous thanks both to Julie and to Bob, but they're not off yet. So I think we should say thank you to them too. And with that, to points made earlier, we are open all the time for consultation, for hearing things, for stakeholder engagement. But I repeat, we recognise many of you want to engage with us in different ways, and we do our best to facilitate that. Thank you.